Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez. Esmeralda Peñalosa takes pride in her parents who immigrated to the United States from Mexico to give their children a better future. The following profile was produced by Josue Gonzalez and Cesar Arros, students at Cedar Ridge High School in Round Rock, Texas.
My name is Esmeralda Peñalosa, and I'm a first-generation American. I was born in Austin, Texas in 1998. Me and my family now live in Round Rock, Texas. My parents immigrated from Guerrero, Mexico in 1991, and they have been living here for about 25 years. I am very proud of my parents because immigrating here is a very hard process, and many people die doing it every year. And my parents did that so me and my sisters could have a brighter future. And that's what most people don't get. They think we come here to take away their jobs, but we do it because things are much worse from where we come from. And we're just trying to progress in life just like any other person. I would say I have the same lifestyle as most teenagers do at my school. I wake up every day, I go to school, I go to my classes, I socialize. The only difference is that my parents immigrated here from Mexico and I speak 2 languages. One of the biggest struggles being a first-generation American was being raised here in the United States by Mexican parents. I was taught Spanish first, then I started school and I had to speak English. As a kid growing up, it was very hard to learn how to speak both languages at the same time. Today I struggle having to always prove to people that I am just as good as an American as I am Mexican. You have to be the best Mexican and American you can be at all times. I have been discriminated before, especially in school. Growing up, kids would make fun of me because of the way I talk. I strongly feel that with the results of the recent election, racial tension has been increasing, which I find ironic that the person who's supposed to help us as a country is tearing us apart. I'm just happy that I can start breaking stereotypes of immigrants by being the first one to graduate high school in my family, showing that our purpose here is to progress in life.
Joseph Sorrentino has published articles and photographs in a number of newspapers and magazines, including the Philadelphia City Paper, 100 Reporters, and In These Times. His work has been funded by the Institute for Justice and Journalism, the Puffin Foundation, the Fund for Investigative Journalism, and the Nation Institute's Investigative Fund. He is our guest today on Fronteras, a Changing America. Joseph, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
You recently were at New Mexico State University giving a talk on workers and asylum seekers on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. What was your takeaway?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that things are changing rapidly in America, that the farm workers that we depend on for food, if they're being deported, we're not going to be able to eat ourselves. And I think it's incredibly important to realize that most of the workers in the United States in our farms, on our dairies, are undocumented. They come from extremely poor villages in Mexico where on average they earn maybe $2 a day. So they need work, we need food. I think there's a way to settle both situations where people can work in this country in a legal way. And I also looked at what life was like for Central Americans coming up through Mexico, hoping to get asylum in the United States. They are facing extreme violence in the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The United Nations recognizes these folks as asylum seekers, and yet we're putting them in detention centers. We're trying to deport them as quickly as possible. I think there's a better way.
How has the immigration issue changed since President Donald Trump took office?
Many ways. His threat to deport millions of people is putting a lot of pressure on people who've been here. I've interviewed people who spent 20 years in the United States as undocumented workers. They're being threatened with deportation. We're supposedly a country that considers family to be incredibly important. Parents are being threatened with deportation. They have a choice. They haven't been in Mexico in 20 years. Their children were born here. Do they leave their children behind? Do they take their children back to a country that the parents no longer know? Prospects of work in Mexico are pretty poor. Do they take their children back to a country that they don't know at all, that they may not even speak Spanish? And this idea that we can keep people out by building a big, beautiful wall. I've interviewed literally hundreds of Central Americans hoping to make it to the United States, getting refugee status. If we build a wall, they'll come in with tunnels. If we block the tunnels, they'll come in by boats. If they can parachute in, they will. These are people who are desperate. They've had, I've talked to people who've had children, their children have been murdered by gangs in Central America. Their lives have been threatened. And if they don't get asylum someplace, if they go back to their country, they face a death sentence.
Joseph, let's talk about your background. You're originally from New York City.
Yep.
You spent some time in Philadelphia. What first got you interested in the immigration issue, in the farm worker issue?
When I moved to Rochester, New York, I found out about these things called exclusion laws. New York state law excludes, labor law excludes farm workers from certain rights guaranteed to virtually all the workers in the United States.
All right, how is that possible?
Well, it comes out, actually, you can trace it, unfortunately, all the way back to slavery. In the 1930s, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was trying to pass the New Deal, he had to make concessions to Southern senators, U.S. senators, who did not want African Americans, who were overwhelmingly farm workers in those days. Almost all farm workers were African Americans in the 30s. These white senators did not want these African Americans to have the same rights and have the same earnings as white workers. So in order to get the New Deal passed, they had to put in place these exclusion laws, not only in New York, but a number of other, I think almost all states in the United States have these exclusion laws, and they grew out of the Jim Crow laws in the early 1900s, which grew out of slavery. So these exclusion laws, in my mind and the mind of many experts who know far more than I do about this, you can actually trace these exclusion laws all the way back to slavery. So when I heard about the exclusion laws, I decided to investigate what life was like for farm workers. And these exclusion laws in New York, there's no right to overtime. There's no right to a day of rest. By law, you're not guaranteed a day of rest, and there's no right to collective bargaining. So I investigated what life was like for farm workers, most of whom are undocumented. And it's a brutal life. It's among the lowest paying jobs in the United States. The conditions on the farm, I mean, it's literally back-breaking work. And we need these workers.
Let's talk about the perception of a farm worker. You know, when people hear about wanting to deport 11 million plus illegal, undocumented immigrants in this country, a majority of them are farm workers. How could you best present the idea of what a farm worker actually does, what their day is like, to somebody who says, deport them all, give the jobs to Americans?
Well, I would invite an American to come on the fields and work on a farm.
You've done it.
Yeah, when I was in Florida in college, I picked oranges for one day. I was told this is the most money you can make part-time. They ran out of water by noon. I actually fell out of a tree, and I didn't find out until I went up to the supervisors and said, I can't do any more work, I'm too tired. You have to fill this really large crate. And he said, well, you don't get paid until you fill the crate. So I stayed until I filled the crate, and I remember spending almost half my money on liquid, on sodas and water when I was on the ride home. And here in New Mexico, I picked chiles for about 4 hours when I was writing about chileros, the chili pickers in southern New Mexico. It's very difficult work. You're on your knees all day in mud. Chiles grow on low bushes. You carry this big bucket that weighs about 20 pounds on your shoulder. You're under a very hot sun, and you get paid 85 cents to $1 a bucket, and each bucket weighs about 20 pounds.
And you carry that bucket?
You carry that bucket on your shoulder to a large crate. It's dumped. You're handed a ficha, a small wooden token, so you can count at the end of the day how many buckets you dumped. And again, 85 cents to $1 for 20 pounds of chiles.
You recently spent 2 weeks in the Fronteras, organizing project shelter in El Paso, Texas. What is the Sin Fronteras organizing project?
Sin Fronteras organizing project is a advocacy organization for farm workers. It's based in El Paso. Historically, workers have come over from Juarez, well, actually any state in northern Mexico, but they come through Juarez and they stay in El Paso, even though they work mostly in New Mexico. They advocate for workers' rights. They help them with a number of health issues, and they have a shelter. These chileros work in our fields picking our world-famous New Mexican green and red chile, and they can't afford an apartment. So they stay in the shelter. But it's not really, workers tell me they can afford an apartment, but then they couldn't afford to buy food and pay utilities.
Yes.
So they sleep in, it's on the floor. There's no beds or cots. You sleep on a linoleum floor. And I spent probably 2 or 3 weeks each of 2 summers there to learn more about what it was like. And it's no privacy, you get up at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning to try to find work. You get home, you get to the shelter at 4, 5, 6 o'clock at night, and you eat dinner and you go right to bed.
How many of these workers are in the Sin Fronteras?
I'm sorry?
How many of these workers are actually in the Sin Fronteras at any given time?
During the peak of the harvest season, around 100, 120. Most, I'd say, I've never seen more than 3 women staying there. Women stay in a small room that they share with a water fountain. The men are in one large room or upstairs, and there are people who sleep outside, because in El Paso in the summer is pretty hot and humid, and this place has 1, 2 small fans that they don't do anything, so people sleep outside around the building as well.
You, again, as you know, looking at your background, being from New York, Philadelphia, the Rochester area, you actually spent some time in Mexico in some of these villages,
right,
to document what these people experience. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. After I wrote my first article about farm workers in upstate New York, and I heard stories about what it was like in the villages, I decided I needed to see it firsthand. I didn't want to just be told what it was like. So with no contacts at all, I went to Mexico. I'd been there on 4 trips previously. A friend in Mexico called an organization called Instituto Maya. They work with campesinos, with rural residents and workers in Mexico. And they said, okay, here are the contacts. I said I wanted to get into these remote villages, and they sent me to coffee growing regions in the Sierra Juarez in Oaxaca. 7 hours by bus from the city of Oaxaca, a couple of hours in the back of a pickup truck, and then a 4-hour hike with Maximiano, who is from this village, was walking me in. 4 hours through these really brutal mountain paths, hot and humid weather, and Maximiano spoke very little Spanish. He spoke Mazateco.
Because it's not, they're local Indian villagers.
Right. So we didn't have much of a conversation. I don't think I could have spoken much anyway. I was so out of breath. And I spent about a week in San Martin, this coffee growing region, and we see all these photographs of coffee growers, and they're smiling and they're happy. These were wonderful people, but every time I was introduced in these villages, they would shake my hand and say, "Nosotros sufrimos mucho." We suffer much. And they weren't complaining, they weren't whining about it, they were stating it as a fact. If you need to get your coffee harvest into the larger village, if you can't afford a mule, which most people can't, you put 70 pounds of coffee on your back, and you walk through these steep mountain paths, and it takes about 7 hours to do that. And when I hiked in and out, I had about 20 pounds of equipment on my back, and I do a lot of biking, I exercise a lot, but I was a half hour into this hike thinking, I'm in way over my head.
70 pounds
70 pounds
of coffee that they would trek through the mountains to get them to the buyer?
They get them to a warehouse. This was a fair trade co-op, and it was situated in a village called San Jose Tenango. And fair trade pays people a little bit more money. They try to preserve indigenous language and culture. But these folks, even though they get a little bit more money, I mean, San Martin and Santa Catarina, most of the villages weren't even really villages. They were just scattered houses, and they had their fields nearby, and they picked that coffee, and they made a couple of bucks a day. And these are the people who want to get to the United States to work on our farms so that we can eat.
So there are farm workers down in Mexico that want to come to the United States and continue what they know best, what they know how to do best.
Yeah, most of these people actually, I mean, they owned the land. Some people did work for others, so they were farm workers technically. Most people don't say they have a farm, they just say they have a field. They work in El Campo. And it's difficult here to get a farm worker to complain, because back when I first wrote the article in 2002, these folks are making, I guess back then, probably $6 an hour, living in substandard housing if they were living anywhere, and thinking, I mean, to their mind is, wait, I'm making $6 an hour here. I'm living in housing that's, to their mind, is better probably than what they have in their village. Why
because
am I
you
going to
compare their lives in these villages where they have no running water, where they have no indoor plumbing, very seldom do they have electricity, and they're comparing it to the life they have in the housing, farm worker housing in the United States.
Yeah, and to my mind, it doesn't make what goes on here right. They are abused. They're called the perfect victims because if they're undocumented, if there's a crime, and I did articles about this when I was in New York, they don't report to the sheriff because they don't want to get deported. They don't want a relative to be deported, and there are not only families but entire villages in Mexico dependent on that income. So I think the abuse in this country of farm workers is just outrageous.
And this is abuse that's been going on for many generations. My father was a bracero. He came up through the bracero program in the 50s and 60s. And in his mind, it was a good program. Why is there no talk, do you feel, in this country to bring back the bracero program?
Probably as several workers, farmers told me, you know, I really like illegal aliens because they don't complain. You know, all this talk about immigration reform, I'm not sure anybody in power or any of the really huge farms want immigration reform, because then workers are going to have rights. They're going to have a way to register complaints. They're going to have a way to say, my wages have been stolen, my Social Security has been stolen, and it's a perfect system for farmers and people making a lot of money, and a really awful system for farm workers.
Let's talk about what I feel is something that's you feature a lot in your work, and that's the plight of Central Americans. You spent 7 weeks in Mexico in January and March in 2015. Most of your time was spent in shelters with Central American migrants. What stories did you find?
Well, I think what's critical to point out, I actually did projects in 2012, 2015, and 2016. And initially in 2012, what we saw were hundreds of people riding La Bestia, the freight trains.
The beast.
Yeah. You may have seen these photographs, and that's what I saw in 2012. Then when I was returning to Mexico in 2015, the advocates were telling me there's nobody on the trains anymore. I'm like, what do you mean? I don't understand. So I went down.
You wrote an article called How the U.S., quote, solved the Central American migrant crisis.
Right. We solved it by pressuring Peña Nieto, president of Mexico, to do something. We don't want 50,000 women and children coming to our border, which happened in 2014. So Peña Nieto actually met with then President Barack Obama, specifically to talk about slowing or maybe even better, stopping Central American migration through the U.S. Peña Nieto announced Programa Fronteras, the southern border program, saying, we're going to protect these migrants and asylum seekers. It's too dangerous on the trains. Gangs are getting after them. It sounded great, but what they've done is they've kept people off the train by brutal methods, attacking them, literally pulling them off trains with hooks, hitting them with tasers. There's one documented case of them being burned out of an area to chase migrants out and asylum seekers out. It's been very effective under U.S. pressure to keep people off the trains. It's been completely ineffective at keeping people out of Mexico. Usually around 400,000 people from Central America, from the Northern Triangle countries, try to enter Mexico. The latest data from 2016 showed it was probably closer to 450,000. So they're not reaching our border.
A year?
A year. So they're not reaching our border because Mexico, as we're deporting, at least last year we say, oh, you know, deportations or people arriving at our border are down by 40 or 50%. That's because Mexico is deporting 50 or 60% more migrants and asylum seekers than they had previously.
And this is under pressure from the United States
Absolutely.
to eliminate this.
Absolutely.
What did you see? What stories did you hear from these Central Americans that were coming? Some of them were seeking asylum.
The majority are seeking asylum. The United Nations High Commission on Refugees says that any person fleeing generalized violence in a country, it should be considered an asylum seeker or refugee. The UN says that these Northern Triangle countries are facing generalized violence. MATAs, the Mata Salvatrucha and the Mata MS-18, both of which started in Los Angeles in the 1980s before they were deported back to Salvador. These gangs are brutal. They extort. If you want to drive a cab or you want to drive a bus in one of the Northern Triangle, you're paying renta, you're paying extortion money. If you want to live in certain neighborhoods in these countries, you pay renta. I talked to one couple, 50% of their salary, their total income, went to the gang to live in that area. I've interviewed people.
And these are people that don't earn much to begin with.
No.
And they're paying 50% of
a very small amount of money. And if you don't, and everybody I ask, what happens if you don't pay? They don't start crying, they just shrug their shoulders and say, they'd kill me and my family. I mean, I've talked to people who've lost a son and 2 grandsons. I've talked to women who were raped. I've talked to people who were kidnapped and held for ransom. And as one woman told me when she fled El Salvador, she was terrified that they were going to follow her because she said, in Salvador, they don't talk, they kill.
Let's talk about the plight of women coming through Mexico. It's not a pleasant one.
No, the best information is probably 80 to 85% of all people traveling through Mexico from the Northern Triangle countries will be attacked, beaten, robbed. About 60% of the women will be raped. Many women get themselves injected with Depo-Provera, which is a birth control. So they're so certain that they'll be raped that they get injected with this birth control. And what I realized after talking to a number of women and advocates, and this is horrible to relate, but it's not one man raping them, it's a gang rape almost all the time. And they may be held for hours or days, they may be raped at different points along their journey, and they don't go to counseling, they don't seek help, they get back on La Bestia or they continue walking because now they can't ride the freight trains. People are literally walking to the United States in hope that they can get asylum.
What are their chances of getting asylum in this country?
Not very good. The process is, especially with women with children, they want to turn themselves into Border Patrol. They're not fleeing, they say we're seeking asylum. I don't know if the conditions have changed. This is what was happening in 2015 and 2016. Again, let's take a woman with a child or 2. They fled violence in their home country. They faced a brutal journey through Mexico. They get to our border, they turn themselves into Border Patrol, say we want asylum. What do? Do we have a welcome sign? You know, we'll take care of you? No. The first stop is what women call the hielera, the freezer, because it's a building that's so cold that they're freezing, and no mattresses, they sleep on the floor. They're there a day or 2, that's the first time they get questioned about their asylum status. It's on a monitor. From what I understand, one lawyer told me they cannot see the person interviewing them, but the interviewer can see them. Terrifying after what they've been through. After a day or 2, they're put in what they call the pedera, the dog pound, because there are chain link fences inside. There they do get a thin mattress to sleep on the floor. And if it's determined that they might qualify for asylum, they go into detention, which is really a prison, which children should not be in. In 2014, they were in these prisons, and these are privately run, $350 per day per person. Privately run in Texas, so Dilley and Carnes. Back in 2014, they were being kept there for months, sometimes as long as a year. Now it's much shorter. If they passed what they call the credible fear interview, that they may qualify for asylum, now they're being released with an ankle monitor. And their official asylum hearing, women that I interviewed in 2016, their asylum hearing was 2019. So for 3 years, they don't know what their status is going to be. Once they're released, it's about 6 months before they're allowed to work, because they have to do an asylum application, they have to file for a work permit. So it's not a terribly welcoming situation.
Joseph, you have a website where you feature your work. What's that website?
Just simply sorrentinophotography.com. Photographs of the people that I've interviewed and links to articles.
Joseph, I want to thank you very much for being here on Fronteras, A Changing America. Thank you for joining us on Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez.